It is Easter weekend in 1967. The Turtles' Happy Together has just knocked the Beatles' Penny Lane from the #1 spot on the music charts. The Vietnam War is raging, and the media is raging about kids these days, all these quote-unquote young boomer girls with their controversial short skirts. Meanwhile, the famous American poet Allen Ginsberg is touring the United States on a big, sold-out tour. A lecturer at the brand new University of New Brunswick St. John campus really wanted to see this tour, but it wasn't coming to Canada. The staffer didn't take no for an answer, though, and basically pestered Allen Ginsberg's team until they finally agreed to do one show in Canada, in St. John, on Easter Sunday, in a church. Allen Ginsberg was going to be coming to read his poem Howl, which is considered one of the most important works of the 20th century in poetry, in part because it was extremely controversial. You've probably heard of Howl and its famous opening lines, read in this little clip by Allen Ginsberg himself.
I saw the best minds of my generation destroyed by madness, starving, hysterical, naked, dragging themselves through the Negro streets at dawn looking for an angry fix.
You're listening to Backyard History, the hidden stories that happened in your own backyard, the podcast version of the weekly history column running in newspapers across the Maritimes, with your host and author, Andrew McLean. The Telegraph-Journal newspaper, which, by the way, runs the Backyard History newspaper column today, offered extensive coverage to Allen Ginsberg's visit to St. John. Although, the newspaper wasn't necessarily what you might call supportive. Although, it wasn't necessarily what you would call unsupportive either. It would probably be treating the visit in a way that would today be described as clickbaity. They were trying to cater to people who loved Allen Ginsberg, and they were also trying to cater to people who hated Allen Ginsberg, and it turns out there were many of both in St. John. On the front page of their big Sunday section, the newspaper ran this big black and white picture of Allen Ginsberg's face, looking dark and ominous, his hand reaching towards the camera. The photo cut out and looming over the text of the article so it looks like he's reaching out of the newspaper to grab you, accompanied by the following very mild editorial note.
Do poets speak the same language? To find out, the Telegraph-Journal assigned Alden Nolan to talk with Allen Ginsberg when he came to St. John on the weekend.
Alden Nolan is today recognized as one of the Maritimes' great poets, and he's got a really cool backstory. He's almost always identified as a New Brunswicker, but Alden Nolan was actually born in Nova Scotia, in absolute grinding poverty in Nova Scotia, to a mother who was only 14 years old. His mother, being a child herself, abandoned him at birth, and he was raised by an abusive father who was deeply opposed to him learning how to read. So Alden Nolan was forced to drop out of school in only grade 4, and he taught himself to read by walking 18 miles to the nearest library. In his teens, he later ran off to New Brunswick, where he was hired by a newspaper, in large part because of his strange application in which he hand-embroidered his resume by sewing it, which apparently is something that newspapers look for in a reporter back then. So by the time the story's taking place, Alden Nolan is 34 years old, and he is not a famous poet. He'd written several books of poetry, but they kind of flopped. He was working the night shift as a reporter for the Telegraph-Journal, and as if his life couldn't get any worse, it turns out he had cancer. So Alden Nolan, who's conducting this interview, is having a bad time in 1967, but his luck is going to turn around. Basically, as soon as this interview is finished, his cancer goes into remission,
His next poetry book, called Bread, Wine, and Salt, comes out. It's a huge hit, and it launches him to Canadian poetry stardom. He quits his job as a night shift reporter, and he lives happily ever after. And this is like 2 months after this interview's done. But this icy March day, where the story's taking place, Alden Nolan is waiting for his interview subject outside of the Admiral Beatty Hotel in St. John. But his interview subject, Allen Ginsberg, doesn't show up. So Alden Nolan goes to the American's hotel room and found it unlocked. So he walked into Allen Ginsberg's hotel room. And when he opened the door, he found Allen Ginsberg sitting on his bed reading the Bible. Nolan asked him what he was reading, and Ginsberg replied,
Ecclesiastes. It's one great, long, bitter poem.
Alden Nolan's plan for writing his profile was that he would walk with Allen Ginsberg around the streets of St. John, and they would chat. He would show him a couple of interesting places in the uptown area, immediately around King Square, ask him some questions, and record his answers. As soon as they walked out of the hotel onto the streets, Nolan noticed that
people stare at Allen Ginsberg. That's not too surprising. He wears a full beard and shoulder-length hair. The crown of his head is almost bald. The hair cascading down to his collar is black and gray. There are patches of brown in his beard. He could be mistaken for an Old Testament prophet. Standing in King Square in St. John in his corduroy slacks, suede ski boots, rainbow-colored necktie, olive drab jacket and hood, with Hindu prayer beads encircling his neck, he might easily be identified as a sailor off an East Indian freighter docked at the Winterport. It is certain that some of the people who saw him wandering around the streets of St. John Saturday muttered beatnik, and this time the epithet was a little more accurate than it generally is, for Allen Ginsberg, one of the few poets who is also a celebrity, helped create the Beat generation.
Allen Ginsberg was 40 years old by the time of his visit to St. John. Although, as you can tell by Nolan's description, he looks a lot older. He is already, by only 40 years old, a generational icon. He was an inspiration to people ranging from Jack Kerouac to Bob Dylan. He was a high-profile writer and media personality. He was a very well-known anti-war activist in the United States, and he was almost certainly recognized by a lot of people in the street as these two poets walked together. Alden Nolan asked him how that felt.
Tell me, Allen, do you mind being stared at?
Well, sometimes I like it, and sometimes I don't, and sometimes it makes me lonesome. But there's one thing about it, it makes it easier to talk with strangers. That sounds funny, but it's true. And as soon as people start talking to me and find out I'm not a homicidal maniac, they're a lot friendlier than they'd be if I didn't look so crazy.
The two of them went to the St. John City Market, which, of course, is still there today. And honestly, it doesn't sound like it's changed very much, right down to the giant moose's head that is still mounted on the wall. Ginsberg noticed this big moose's head, and he commented on it, saying,
I guess the moose is sort of your national symbol here in New Brunswick. The Hindu god Vishnu was sometimes reincarnated as an animal. Maybe he was reborn as a moose.
He laughs. Ginsberg laughs a great deal. It is a surprisingly boyish laugh for a man of 40, just as his voice is surprisingly gentle with just a hint of a New York accent.
I like this place. You know, St. John reminds me of the 1930s. I don't know why, but there's something about this market that's straight out of the 1930s, the good part of the 1930s.
Ginsberg bought a bag of dulse and a tiny container of head cheese, and they walked out of the city market onto the icy streets of St. John. Alden Nolan moved to more controversial questions, asking him about the Vietnam War, to which Ginsberg replied,
I'm not pro-communist. I don't think there is any right side to the war. The U.S. may be more in the wrong than the communists, but that's only because the U.S. is bigger, stronger, should be more responsible.
Alden Nolan wanted to ask about drugs, noting that
Ginsberg's frank espousal of drugs has got him into hot water a few times. There were rumors on the eve of his arrival in St. John that immigration officials would prohibit his entry into Canada.
When Nolan goes to actually ask about drugs, though, in phrasing his question, he refers to marijuana as a narcotic. Allen Ginsberg did not like marijuana being called a narcotic very much, though, retorting,
Marijuana is not a narcotic, but a herb. It wasn't banned in the US until the 1930s, and then the ban was more or less accidental. It's been proved it is not an addictive drug, and that its use doesn't lead to the use of real narcotics like heroin. Marijuana is not only completely harmless, it is actually beneficial. It opens up entirely different areas of consciousness. The time will come when the sale of marijuana is legal.
An elderly woman had fallen down on King Street. Ginsberg helped her to her feet. Blood ran from her nose. He assisted her to a store, and an employee brought her a chair. He bought a packet of tissues with which to staunch the blood.
as more St. Johners rushed over to help the elderly woman who'd fallen and who was bleeding. Allen Ginsberg stepped back and marveled.
That wouldn't have happened in New York. In New York, nobody would have stopped, let alone helped her.
Then he pulled out the dulce he had just bought at the market, tore off a little piece, ate it, and said,
"Ah, New Brunswick marijuana."
They walked up past King Square and strolled through the Loyalist Burial Ground, which is a tree-lined sort of urban park that's actually an ornate graveyard that St. Johners are very proud of. And Alden Nolan said,
Look, Allen, every poet who comes to St. John writes a poem about the Loyalist burying ground. There have been thousands of them. You'll have to write one.
Many drunks have slipped on this snow and bloodied their head upon these stones. That's my poem.
At least one fan appeared as the two poets walked. This was a bearded student who Nolan described as
Talking more like a hipster than Ginsberg did.
Man, we're gonna pack 'em in tonight. Howden Ross say all the kids were saying today we'll have to hear that cat read all those dirty words.
That'll bring them in, and they'll get a chance to hear the truth. Do you realize truth is a 5-letter word?
And this is where things probably need a bit of explanation, because what happens next is somewhat unusual. The poem Allen Ginsberg had come to St. John to read, called Howl, had been put on trial in the United States for obscenity. And by obscenity, the American courts didn't mean obscene things like swearing. Well, they actually did mean swearing, because there were a couple swear words in Howl. But it wasn't the swear words that got Howl put on trial. Howl was a poem about a lot of things that were considered obscene back when it was written in 1954 and 1955. One of the poem's inspirations were drugs, specifically a terrifying peyote vision that Allen Ginsberg had experienced. Drugs are explicitly referred to in the poem, and that was considered obscene by the US government back then. Another inspiration for the poem was Allen Ginsberg's therapist telling him that he should stop fighting it, and he should just accept that he was gay. As I'm sure you know, being a homosexual in the 1950s was not legal, and in Howl there are some very explicit references to being gay. There are also references in Howl to mental health, to how he and his friends had been placed in mental institutions and had undergone electroshock therapy. There were references to anti-government politics, anti-war politics, references to drinking, addiction, some of his friends dying, a lot of references to his childhood and his mother, who had schizophrenia. But who are we kidding? It was the gay stuff that got Howl put on trial in the United States. And that really was the part that was considered obscene. The long story short, this obscenity trial ended with Judge Clayton W. Horn's famous ruling that Howl was not obscene. And in his ruling, he asked the question,
would there be any freedom of press or speech if one must reduce his vocabulary to vapid, innocuous euphemisms?
So, for all of that context and all of that controversy, you might wonder how Allen Ginsberg ended up in St. John in the first place. The strange answer to that story appears in a 1998 book called Quiet Campus, A History of University of New Brunswick in St. John. Apparently a lecturer named John Grube had personally gone to the rather conservative university administration of the day to invite him. According to Grube himself, this caused a quote-unquote enormous kerfluffle. He was fully aware that Principal G. Forbes Eliot would ban Allen Ginsberg, so he had secretly set the whole thing up by personally pulling strings with, of all things, the local Conservative Party Member of Parliament, Gordon Fairweather. Grube claimed that Principal Eliot caught wind that Allen Ginsberg would be coming to town, and he tried to have it arranged that Allen Ginsberg got stopped at the Canadian-US border. And then that Conservative MP personally intervened to make sure that Allen Ginsberg got a special permit to cross into Canada. In a truly bizarre quote, possibly one of the strangest ones we've heard on this podcast, John Grube claimed that the university's leader personally stood outside of the church where Allen Ginsberg was about to read Howl, begging St. Johners to not go in and listen to this poetry reading.
When he was about to read, I was told that Forbes Eliot was standing outside the church saying, "Don't go in, don't go in. I am principal at UNBSJ, and I am saying don't go in. He is a dreadful person."
What happened inside that church during Allen Ginsberg's reading of Howl in St. John on Easter Sunday in 1967 was not ever covered by a normal review. Instead, as part of its rather clickbaity policy of the time, the Telegraph-Journal made a strange decision to send two different people to go to the show, one of whom absolutely loved Allen Ginsberg's poetry, perhaps a little too much, and a second person who quite literally thought Allen Ginsberg was the human embodiment of evil. And then the newspaper published these people's incredibly biased reviews side by side. Our two reviewers of that poetry reading were both women, and their names were Peggy Smith and Alice Armstrong. Peggy seems to have pretty much had a life-changing experience at the show, writing.
Our souls were torn open, yes, laid bare unexpectedly by Ginsberg, whose crazy appearance made him so akin to us, closer than a brother or a lover. Not just me, he had that effect on everyone. He's such a kind man, meaning only the highest good, wishing to straighten us tight thinkers out, wrench loose our biased minds, pried with very few four-letter words at the outside castings in a way used by Stravinsky, Picasso, Miller, and others in his category. Words placed out of context side by side, unlikely images juxtaposed, merely to show that all things are good. The middle-aged English teachers who got up and offered their seats as early as possible proved that some people weren't ready for any shock treatments. No, we left wanting to hear him again, to know him better, to drag him off to a party of a smaller nature. He was colossal.
Obviously, that was the good review. It's probably hard to find a more fawning review than that. But not everyone felt like Peggy. As she alluded to, a significant number of St. Johners had walked out of the church in a fit of anger when Allen Ginsberg read Howl. Among them was Alice Armstrong, who felt just as passionately about Allen Ginsberg as Peggy Smith had, but from a very different angle.
I heard Ginsberg is this so-called poet celebrity from the United States. Was more than a beatnik. He was an evil man with a mouth like a sewer. What a sad reflection of our times that instead of inspiring and delighting with the beauties of literary skill in prose and poetry, we expose our young minds to the likes of this man, the self-admitted user of marijuana. The following day, I heard a taped interview with Professor John Drew on the radio, indicating Ginsberg expressed interest in St. John to the point of inquiring about the rentals of apartments facing the square. What makes Professor Drew think we would want this man as a resident? We have enough shaggy-haired, bearded crackpots strolling through the streets now without the kingpin. God deliver us from acquiring him as a citizen. Go home, Ginsberg. Go home and take your filthy mind with you.
After the show, Alden Nolan walked with Allen Ginsberg back to the hotel, but instead found that Ginsberg wanted to go to a bar. So Nolan left Ginsberg there, and he walked home, writing.
As we left him in front of a tavern on King Square, he raised his hands in a gesture of prayer and said,
Peace.
That was Backyard History with your host, Andrew McLean. Thanks for listening, and stay tuned for another hidden story that happened in your own backyard. Produced by Jordan Lozier.